All right, it's good to be here again tonight, and we're going to go to the Lord in prayer before we get started. It's good to have Brother Reese, Brother Bobby with us tonight. We appreciate them coming to visit and be with us. You know, about everybody says that they're going to come back and sit in and visit, but a lot of them don't. So I'm glad y'all did. We'll put you on the "you did" list, but it is good to be here and good to see y'all. And we're going to go to the Lord in prayer, and let's remember our nation in our prayers, remember our leaders in our prayers, one another, and then there's been some special objects that's been mentioned tonight. Let's remember them. I'll ask Brother Bobby if he would lead us in prayer tonight.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us together, Lord God. Thank you for the men that's put so much effort into this school. Lord, I pray that you would bless them. I thank you for the men and women, Lord, that we have spent time with here in the past. I pray that you'd also bless them, Lord, all the prayer requests that's been mentioned, Lord God. I pray you to put your hand upon that. Lord, I pray you be with our country, Lord, the leaders. Lord, I pray that you just guide your hand upon our country, Lord. Lord, we want to take out that we love you. We thank you for all the things you've done, Lord, all the things you're going to do, Lord. We just thank you for our heavenly home, most of all our Savior, Lord Jesus Christ. We thank you for him. Lord, we love you tonight, and we pray in Jesus Christ's heavenly name. Amen.
Amen. All right, we appreciate that. We are on page 181 in our book, American Crimson Red. This is the chapter entitled A Corn of Wheat, which is chapter number 8. And we're moving along in this. We'll have a test eventually, and before we do, I'll give a review and go over. I've been trying to mention, I probably need to do a little better job, but any dates or anything I really want you to have in your notes, I'll try to emphasize that when we come to it. But probably in a few weeks we'll have a test. But like I said, we will have a review before we have a test. But the very last thing that we talked about, or just mentioned really, last week we got up to the subject of the War of the Regulators. And in our books that starts on page 181. As I said, chapter 8 is entitled A Corn of Wheat. And he gets that from John chapter number 12 and verse number 24. And of course, we're going to talk tonight about Shubal Stearns passing away, and I'll just read John 12:24. It's a great passage of Scripture. I've preached out of this several times over the years, but the great truth there, that there has to be a death in order for there to be life, and he uses a corn of wheat to illustrate that. But John chapter 12, verse number 24, Jesus said, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit." And so he likens that to the life of Shubal Stearns, that he was one life. But the fruit that came out of this great revival, the Separate Baptist Revival, and we looked at that and talked about what the fruit was. The fruit was souls, the fruit was preachers, and the fruit was churches. And so the life of Shubal Stearns. Let me give you some dates to begin with that I want you to have in your notes. October 1769. This was the last meeting of the Sandy Creek Association before it broke up. And this took place before the War of the Regulators, which we're going to look at tonight. The War of the Regulators, or the Battle of Alamance, it's called sometimes. Took place a couple of years after that, but October of 1769. The following resolution was made at the Sandy Creek Association meeting, and it said, "If any of our members shall take up arms." And so they made a resolution. What are they going to do about this brewing political problem that was going on? And it was between the settlers, between the colonists, and between the royal government, and at that time headed up by Governor Tryon, and things kept getting worse and worse and worse. And they begin to ask, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? And so the minutes of the meeting do not say who made the resolution, but it was more than likely Elder Stearns that brought it up or was behind it. But it's interesting, historically speaking, that nothing was accomplished after that. They made this resolution. The only thing they accomplished after that, they didn't act upon it, but they just said that the next year's meeting was going to be at Grassy Creek. And so that was the last order of business at Sandy Creek. And then the year after this, they separated. And so the last order of business under a United Sandy Creek Association was unfinished business. They put this resolution on the table that if anybody took up arms against the government, which they were talking about the British government, that they would be excommunicated because of that. But they did not act upon it. And so it's interesting historically, that's the last thing they ever acted on, but they didn't do anything about it. Well, the following year, 1770, they met at Grassy Creek. And I'm sure you've already read in your book, but the first day they tried to conduct business. And they couldn't get anything accomplished. And so what they would do when they couldn't get anything accomplished, they would adjourn to the next day. And they would even have a day to pray and fast about it. And so this went on, and they weren't getting anything accomplished. They couldn't get any business taken care of. And so the first thing that was finally brought up that they all agreed on was that Sandy Creek should be divided into 3 districts. And that's exactly what they did. And if you read in your book, it talked about Shoeball Stearns had been preaching, and he was coming home, and he had what he sort of referred to as a vision, or he saw something. He didn't have a vision, he saw something. But the Lord spoke to his heart, and what he saw was a thunderstorm rolling in, and then it divided and went north and went south, and part of it stayed where it was. And he felt like that God had already spoken to his heart and prepared him that his work was going to be divided, and that it would go to the north and it would go to the south, and the greater part would stay where it was. And that's exactly what happened the following year, 1770. They voted, and that was the first thing that they, with unanimous consent, voted upon, was that they were going to divide. And it had become such a huge association that it was hard to keep track of anyway. The churches in North Carolina remained at Sandy Creek, so there remained a Sandy Creek Association, but as we're going to see, because of the Battle of Alamance and the problems with the government, they did not remain as strong as they were. The churches in South Carolina became the Congaree Association. And I know we're all in the South, but my South Carolina pronunciations are not the best in the world, and the same when you get up some places in Virginia. But some places you have to live there to know how to say it. And where I live is that way as well. Everybody says we live in Velas, but we don't live in, and us 3, we all live in Vilas. But anyway, I hope I'm not pronouncing these wrong, but I might be. North Carolina, they remained at Sandy Creek. South Carolina, Congaree Association. And then the churches in Virginia, they became the Rapidan Association. And they later changed that to the General Association of Separate Baptists. And so that took place in 1770. Then the Battle of Alamance in May 16th, 1771. And the Battle of Alamance, we'll look at that just a little bit and think about it. But, we say, well, what does church history, what do we learn from it? Is there anything relevant to today? Some things we could ask ourselves as we look at this chapter. Should we ever protest, or should we just submit to whatever the government says? Some look at Romans chapter number 12 and say, well, we should just obey just whatever the government says, and we shouldn't protest or we shouldn't say anything. Or we could learn from church history what is an effective way to protest. And the regulators and the American Revolutionary War, you definitely find some lessons there of how to effectively protest. And what happened with the regulators definitely led into the First Amendment. And then we can look around here at all these protests that are going on in our country, and there's a lot of protesting been going on. Something happened at Berkeley, I think, last night, and they protesting. I come home Wednesday night, watched a few minutes of the news, and they were protesting the Supreme Court nomination, and it's just new protests all over the country. Well, are these people, are they acting within their constitutional rights to do that? And I'll just give you a quick answer on that. I had to find this on my phone, but I've got the First Amendment. What is going on is not a group of people exercising their constitutional rights. We do not have a constitutional right to get out here and destroy private property, loot businesses, turn over police cars, set trash cans on fire, attack people violently. That is not exercising our constitutional rights. The First Amendment says this, and the First Amendment is a result of things that had gone on before the American Revolutionary War that we're studying about. And the regulators tried to live peaceable with all men. They tried to gather peaceably. They tried to bring their petitions before the governor. They tried a lot of times to work things out and not have anything to do with arms. But our constitutional right is this, the First Amendment: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so if people if they're gathering together but it's not peaceable, then they're breaking the law. And so what ought to be done about this? Well, if you're turning over police cars, if you're breaking out windows, you ought to be arrested. Yeah. You ought to be put in jail, hauled before the court, pay the people back that you damaged the stuff. There's nothing constitutional or good about what's going on. So we really need to pray for our country. There's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way. And I feel like what's going on is spoiled brats didn't get their way and they're tearing their country all to pieces. Yeah. You know, I had somebody, I don't mean to get off on this, but I had somebody belly aching to me about it. And I said, well, I felt that way for 8 years, but I didn't bellyache about it every time I saw you. Yeah. And so anyway, we learn things from history. We learn things that have worked, and we ought to learn things that don't work. And so the Battle of Alamance, and we'll say a little bit more about that, but that took place, make sure you got these dates, May 16th, 1771. And then Shubal Stearns. Shubal Stearns died November the 20th, 1771. So before things ever really advanced very far, Shubal Stearns passed away. And there's some lessons that we can learn about the breakup of the Sandy Creek Association. And I'll give you those tonight. One thing we can learn is, I'll put it like this, Christianity is not a spectator sport. It's not the Lord's will for us to just sit on the sidelines of life and watch it go by and never say anything, never do anything. It's not the Lord's will for us to just withdraw within the church walls and just let the world go by. God, we have a responsibility to be involved. We have a responsibility to be vocal about what is right and about what is wrong. And Proverbs chapter 31 and verses 8 and 9 says this, "Open thy mouth for the dumb in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy." And so what does the Bible say about social things? Open thy mouth. And that's not to put our foot in, but to speak right and to do right and to be on the side of right. We are to speak out. And we live in a world, sometimes people have good questions. And if we have the truth, and we do, and we have the light, and we have the right answers, then we ought to be able to provide those answers. We ought to be able to give an answer to every man that asks us the question, the hope that lies within us. So we're to speak out. And a lot of our problems is that Christians for years and years have just been quiet and gone about their business and just let the world go along. But we ought to be vocal. And so we learned that about this, that the people that were around Shubal Stearns, they were coming to him and they were asking him and they were inquiring, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? I mean, things were getting very, very tense in North Carolina. But Shubal Stearns, he did not provide leadership on these lines. And I'm not throwing stones by any means. I'm not saying that he done wrong. I think with the light that he had, he done what he thought. There's no example for this. He couldn't look at history like us. If he looked at Europe and saw the Baptists over there, he saw people that were persecuted, and they were pacifists. And then there's no example in America that he would have probably been real well acquainted with. So I think he done the best that he could with what he had. But people were looking to him, and he just didn't provide very much leadership. One book I read said that the other preachers simply did not want to oppose Elder Stearns out of love and respect. And couldn't you see that as well? I mean, here's Shubal Stearns, and I mean he's been the faithful man of God, and God has used him greatly. And some of these younger preachers, they may have had other thoughts, they may have had other ideas, but they didn't want to oppose what Shubal Stearns said. So maybe that is right. Some things in history we don't know and we won't ever know, and we can suppose, but we're just guessing. And other people have done that as well. Romans chapter 8 verse 28 says this though, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose." And so how this all worked out, I believe it worked out how the Lord meant for it to. The last thing they done at the Sandy Creek Association was that they didn't really do anything. And then within the next year, there's a battle. And then shortly after that, Shubal Stearns passes away. He passes off the scene. So number one, we learn that we are to be involved in life. It's not to consume us. God's work comes first, but we ought to have answers. We have the Word of God. We have the truth. Number two, there's a good lesson here. This is a good lesson for pastors as well, but division is not always a bad thing. Sometimes we act like, it's just, oh my goodness, it's the end of the world. We had 2 families leave the church, and, it's always discouraging as a pastor when you have people leave. But sometimes it's better to leave. It's better to have somebody leave than it is for them to stay and destroy the church. And so division is not always a bad thing. I've been preaching through the book of Judges on Wednesday night. And we're talking about Gideon. And, he had an army of 32,000. Well, that's great. And then it got whittled down to 10,000. Well, that's not as good as it was, but still that's pretty good. Then it got down to 300. But it wasn't until they divided down to 300 that then God said, by these 300, I'll deliver the Midianites into your hand. And so sometimes, and we looked at this in one of our studies, sometimes there's too many to do what really needs to be done. So division is not always a bad thing. The division of the Sandy Creek Baptist Association made the way for all these other men, for God's purpose to be accomplished in their life. And so it didn't destroy anything, but what it did, it provided more opportunities. North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, as they branched out and as they went out and they started more churches. And there's a great work that was done up in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, and through coming west through North Carolina up through the Yadkin, coming south from Virginia into the Appalachian Mountains, on over into Tennessee. So it provided a huge opportunity just for God's work to branch out all throughout the South. And so it wasn't the end of the world. Now, think about it like this. What if they would not have divided? And what if they'd come back the next year and they would have taken up where they left off, and they'd have said, okay, we're going to pass that resolution. None of us take up arms against the government. None of us fight against the British. If that would have happened, we might very well be drinking tea tonight instead of coffee. And we'd be talking about the cricket games. But really, we probably wouldn't be here. We'd think we was going to heaven because we was baptized as an infant. What happened during this time period, it had a huge influence on the formation of our country, churches, biblical beliefs. It talks about, even in the book, that the Episcopal Anglican churches were dying. And there's very, very few of them. And the Baptist people, churches, were growing by multitudes. And even today, if you see a Episcopal church, just very few and far between. And I thank the Lord for that. I'd rather pass. I think there is an Episcopal something on the way over here, but I'd rather pass 10 or 15 Baptist churches that are preaching the truth than I had there be one Baptist church and 10, 15, 20 churches not preaching the truth. So these things, they had a great influence, and we're still reaping the benefits today. This is something to think about. If the Patriots were wrong, then we're wrong. We're wrong to be free, and we're wrong to be Americans, and we're wrong to talk about the First Amendment and the Second Amendment and the Third. If they were wrong, if they done wrong, then we're wrong. We ought to repent and go back to England and say, take us back. But I don't think anybody would say, well, they were wrong. They shouldn't have done that. I believe they tried as long as they could to make it work and to be peaceable. But I see the hand of God in our country, and I'm glad we're not. I'm glad for the American Revolution. I'm glad for our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, and that our money says liberty and in God we trust. And, I'm thankful for it tonight. And so it had a great impact on our country. Now, let me give you some definitions. We come across these words all the time. Patriot. When we talk about the Patriots, they were colonists that were loyal to the cause of the independence of America. That's who when we're talking about the patriots. Colonists loyal to the cause of independence for the American colonies. So the patriots, they were for separation from England, and they were for us becoming our own nation, not just a colony of Great Britain. So we talk about the patriots. Then the book talks about the Tories, and to be a Tory. Are the Tories, these were colonists that were loyal to the British Crown prior to and during the Revolutionary War. So the Tories, that's the ones that were loyal to Britain and the King. And the Patriots, they're loyal to the American Revolution, to George Washington and our independence. Now, there's another group, the pacifists. To be a pacifist is a person that believes that war is unjustifiable under any means. And a pacifist believes that violence is unjustifiable, and a true pacifist wouldn't even take up arms to defend their own selves. And if Shubal Stearns would have looked at the history of, if he'd have read Fox's Book of Martyrs, Fox's Book of Martyrs is full of people that were pacifists. I mean, I've read that, and I'm sure you have too. And a lot of these people, I mean, some of them tried to get away, but some of them didn't even try to run. And they knew that they were going to hunt them down, they were going to haul them, they were going to put them in prison, they were going to torture them, and then they were going to burn them at the stake. And so, or they'd throw them to the lions. And you read in Fox's Book of Martyrs, a lot of these early Christians, they said to die for Christ. You know, that it was an honor, that it was their, that it was the will of God. And I'm not saying it wasn't, but I also look. They had no way to defend themselves. If they ran away, there was nowhere to go. I mean, they didn't have a lot of options. But then the farther you come along in history, you find that God's people, they begin to explore their options. And they, you know, it talks about it in the Gospels, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but Jesus said, you know, if you're persecuted in one place, flee to the next city. And so they begin to look in the Bible and they say, you know, well, it'd be all right to get away and preach the gospel another day. And it'd be all right to hide. And so anyway, the pacifist, the regulators, we talk about the War of the Regulators. Who were the regulators? Max Dixon, I've got a couple of books by him. He's got a book called The Wataugans, and actually Brother Doug gave that to me the last time we went through church history, but he's more of a secular writer, and he called it a revolt of Western farmers. But G.W. Paschal, and it talks about him several places in this book, he was a professor at Wake Forest when Wake Forest was associated with the Southern Baptist. Of course, they're not anymore. But Mr. Paschal, he wrote 2 books on the history of the Baptists. One was published in 1931 and 1955. And in both of those books, he called the War of the Regulators the war against the Baptists. And if you've read chapter number 8, you know it talks about Governor Tryon and him intimidating, and he wouldn't listen to the concerns of the Baptist people, although he said that he would, but actually he didn't. And so they had some legitimate concerns. Some of their concerns were religious and some were civil. One of the things that they were opposed to was the property tax. And another thing was a poll tax, which was the sale of goods. If you went and sold something at the market, you had to pay a tax on it. The other concern they had was a religious concern. That was a parish tax, and that parish tax is really what got the Baptist people. This tax that they were supposed to pay, but it went to support the Anglican Church. Well, they didn't support the Anglican Church. They'd quit taking their babies to be baptized as infants, and they didn't believe in that, but they were supposed to pay this tax to support the Anglican Church. And so those three taxes and the Declaration of Independence talks about taxation without representation. Well, they tried. They went and they said, some of this is not right. Some of this is excessive. They found out that they had been being taxed, and all this is in the book. I'm just sort of summarizing it, but they found out that they had been taxed excessively, and that there was misuse of funds. That's what we would call it. They're stealing off of it. And so they protested all this, but no satisfaction was given. There were some other acts which were passed, which galled the people in North Carolina. One was called the Schism Act. And the Schism Act was no schoolmaster was allowed without a license from the Bishop of London. And so to be a teacher, you had to have the permission of the Anglican Church. That's what that boiled down to. And so the Baptist people, they protested against that. And since they protested against that, they got labeled as ignorant and illiterate, and basically in our terminology, them old, they're uneducated and all this kind of stuff. And so the Schism Act, they protested against that. In 1741, there was what was called the Marriage Act. And the Marriage Act meant that exclusive rights to marry came from the Church of England. And I'll just say this quickly. Marriage is God's institution. And marriage is God's idea. And every time the government gets involved in this, it's just a mess. And we see that not too recently in our own country with all the gay marriage and all that kind of stuff. There's no such thing as that. You want to do that? I'm not saying it's good, but don't call it marriage. Marriage is God's idea. Marriage is God's institution. And therefore, God ought to be the one that defines it. And God does define it. It's a man and a woman. But this thing about government getting involved in marriage, it's not a new thing. It's been around a long time. Well, if the Baptist people didn't believe that the Anglican Church was a true church, they wouldn't take their babies to get baptized. They call that the badge of the great whore. Would you go to that church to get married? Well, no, they're not going to go to that church to get married. So basically what all this did was made them non-citizens. But they live in the community, they work in the community, they contribute to the community, they sure pay taxes in the community. But then they go to the leadership and they're not even recognized. Well, they have no birth record. See, birth records were established when you baptized your infant in the church. But if you don't do that, there's no official government record of your birth. And then if you won't go to them to get married, but you say, well, we don't need them, we'll go to the preacher down here and he'll marry us, but it's not officially recognized. And so they're in a mess. And they're trying to fix this as much as they can. So the Marriage Act, the infant baptism, the Schism Act, you don't recognize us teaching our children. They've got more than one concern. These are serious things. Then there was a Proclamation Act of 1763. The Proclamation Act of 1763 said that there was a boundary line to the west. And so if we're in North Carolina, if we're down around Yadkin, Alamance, Rowan, Orange County, all the middle of the state, and the government said there was a boundary line to the west, which was basically saying you can't go over there, that's no trespassing. And even the Watauga settlement, when they came, when that group of settlers came, they bought land off the Cherokees. They leased land off the Cherokees. They formed their own government, basically in this large area. And so they did that in order to do business with the Cherokees. But again, the government said, well, that's not legitimate. The government has said you can't go over there. You don't need to be over there. And you don't need to be doing that. And that's talked about in the Declaration of Independence. That the Crown, that King George wouldn't allow the populating of these states, these colonies. And so they had a lot of legitimate concerns about the government and what was going on. So the reach of the government, it was affecting their children. Now, did they have a legitimate protest? It affected their children and their children's education. It affected their marriages, whether they were even recognized as being legally married or not. It affected their movements, where they could go, and it affected their money, and it affected their worship. And so they had legitimate concerns about what was going on. Now, Dr. Beller doesn't talk about this in the book, but there's another aspect of what was going on in North Carolina, this friction. We might call it ethnically. What you have, and remember a few weeks ago we was talking about George Whitefield, and he was talking about in North Carolina there's a big Scotch-Irish population. And so there's a huge influx of people from Scotland and Ireland in North Carolina, and they're moving west. They're coming into the Appalachian Mountains. And if you look around, and I was looking around coming over here tonight, cemeteries, business names, there's all in this region. There's a huge Scotch-Irish influence. And but the government was English, and the religion was Anglican. And if you go back to Great Britain, and I'm talking about before the American Revolution, before the 1700s, and you study the history of England, there was 1,000 years of butting heads between England and Scotland and Ireland. And I mean, this fighting, and even, was it last year or year before, that Scotland was going to vote to become their own country? I mean, this goes back, this England being superior to Scotland and reigning over Scotland, and Scotland butting heads with England. You've probably read about, in England, Hadrian's Wall, and the border between Scotland and England. So this is a rivalry or tension that would go all the way back to England. So these Scottish people are populating North Carolina, and they've come over here. They're seeking religious freedom. They come to the New World, and what's the first thing they run into? There's England again, telling us what to do. And so all these things contribute to coming up to the American Revolutionary War. But moving along, on page 194 in our book, he gives 4 results from the division at Sandy Creek. And this is all interesting to me, just to read through how Governor Trine, and I'm on page 187, he used violence and intimidation against the Baptist people. it talks about extortion and fraud agitated the pioneers. So all that, I mean, if you like history, you'll get a lot out of it. But he talks about 4 results from the divisional, and he starts that on page 194. 4 results from the division. And I'm going to give these to you. This would be good to have in your notes. Number 1, the association lost its unity. And so up to that point, 1769, they stressed they wouldn't vote on anything, they wouldn't pass anything unless it was 100%. And if they couldn't get it, they'd go and they'd fast and they'd pray and they'd come back together, but they could not get together on the regulator question. And so they lost their unity and they separated into the 3 different associations. As a result of that, Shubal Stearns lost a lot of his immediate influence because the association separated. So now they got Grassy Creek, and now they got Congaree, and they're branching off into Virginia. And so he loses a lot of his influence. And we can look at that from a spiritual standpoint. You know, it's not the Lord's will that any of us be the Baptist Pope. You know, God took Gideon, and Gideon, he said, I'm the least in my Father's house. And so among God's choice servants, fame, power, influence, it just doesn't it doesn't last long, and it doesn't set well for the spiritual life of anybody. And so we find that Shubal Stearns, he sort of passes off the scene before he passes away. Shortly after that, he passed away, but his influence goes down. Another thing that happened, and you find this in history books, it's talked about in this book, but as a result of the Battle of Alamance, 1,500 Baptist families fled North Carolina, and most of them went west into the Appalachian Mountains and over into what would become Tennessee and the Watauga settlement. And so when they had trouble, and if you read what happened at the Battle of Alamance, it was couldn't even really be called wasn't like a Civil War battle by any means, but it was a 2-hour battle. 9 people died on both sides, 18 in all. But the intimidation and nothing ever changed, and people just gave up on it, and they left. So Sandy Creek, all the people and all the good work that was done there, they quit it and they left. Baptist people in history have never been warmongers. They've never been persecutors, as far as like the other denominations and Catholicism, where they have tried to make people convert with the sword. You don't find the Baptist mindset. The Bible mindset is not, we're going to make you do this and make you go to church. So you don't find that. You find that Baptist people have been peaceable, and for the most part, just want to be left alone. And they were not being left alone. So a lot of them, they quit. They quit the province and they went other places. Number 4, he talks about this in the book. Separate Baptists scrambled over the Alleghenies to bring revival to the American frontier. And so, did any good come out of it? Sure. If you look in the Bible and you go back to the book of Acts, and you find there in the book of Acts that really the gospel didn't really begin to go out until you get to Acts chapter number 8 and the great persecution. And then it said, then they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. And so same thing happened here. They that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the Word. And so, why is the Bible Belt the Bible Belt? Partly because of persecution. Yes, there was this great revival at Sandy Creek, but it dispersed, spread, and all these people. And so it's interesting. Here's another verse from the Bible talking about Joseph, Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. He said this, "But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive." And so sometimes when the devil does his worst, God does his best. And the devil tries to shut God's people down, but God gets the glory in the end. And so we're thankful for that. Thankful for the Lord's ability to oversee in all the different circumstances, all the persecution and all the opposition. And it's 1 Corinthians chapter 2, and I think verse 29, where it says that no flesh should glory in his presence. And so we find God's hand in all of this. Now, we'll just keep reading ahead. This chapter comes to the end with the death of Shubal Stearns, and then he starts talking about chapter number 9. We go back up north. And so I hope you're enjoying this book. He does jump around a lot. And so you started chapter 8 with James Ireland, and he told a little story about him, and then he just left him, and then in the end he picks him back up and he talks about him, and there's this long story in between. So it takes a little paying attention, but it's really, really good information. All right, we're going to jump off right there. Appreciate your good attention. Hope everybody's safe going home, and appreciate the Lord letting us be here tonight. All right, you're dismissed.